Good evening, everyone. Could we take our seats, please?
Okay, we're keeping it as is.
Okay. Right, good evening, members, officers and visitors, and welcome to the Communities, Housing and Environment Committee meeting, acts as the Crime and Disorder Committee. Before we get to the agenda, may I take this opportunity to advise you that we are not expecting the fire alarm to sound tonight, so if it does, please remain seated, and Ms Tunnicliffe, to my right, will assess the situation and give further instructions on the evacuation of the building if appropriate. Tonight's proceedings will be webcast by the Council, but if anyone else is intending to record these proceedings, can you please let me know now? I ask this question not to stop you, but merely to ensure that members and other members of the public in the room know that this is taking place. I would also like to welcome Chief Inspector Mick Gardner and Inspector Mark Hedges to our meeting, as they will be giving a presentation to the committee after. Before we go to the agenda, can you please make sure all mobile phones are on silent, please? Okay, now to the agenda. Agenda item 1, apologies from absence. I have apologies from Councillor Webster and Councillor Mortimer. Item 2, notification of substitute members.
Substituting for Councillor Mortimer. Thank you.
Just come in a second, please. Was there not apologies received from Councillor Webb?
No, I've not had it.
My understanding is that he normally contacts Caroline.
Yeah.
Item 3, urgent items. There are none. Item 4, notification of visiting members. Oh, sorry, John.
Councillor Perry is substituting for Councillor Webster.
Yeah, apologies.
That's fine, Chair.
Item 4, notification of visiting members.
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening. Councillor Faye Gooch, I would like to contribute to the questions on... Is there another agenda item? I thought it was going to be agenda item 12, but if not, agenda item 11, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gooch. Item 5, disclosures by members and officers. Are there any? No? Item 6, disclosures of lobbying. No. Item 7, to consider whether any item should be taken in private because of the possible disclosure of exempt information. There are no yellow pages on the agenda tonight. Item 8, minutes of the meeting held on the 28th of March 2017. I'll go through these as usual, page by page. There's only 2 of them. Page 1. Page 2. No? Happy that I signed this as a true record? Thank you. Item 9, presentation of petitions, if any. There are none. Item 10, question and answer session for members of the public, if any. There are none. Item 11, 2018-19 strategic assessment. As stated previously, the committee will be considering the strategic assessment by report, and then this will be followed by the presentation by Chief Inspector Gardner and Inspector Hedges. Nick.
Thank you very much. The following recommendation for the committee with regard to the strategic assessment is that the Communities, Housing and Environment Committee, acting as the Crime and Disorder Committee, accept the priorities as recommended in the 2018-19 strategic assessment and to be taken forward for inclusion within the Community Safety Plan for 2018-19. I trust, obviously, you've all inwardly digested and read. That's better. Okay. Is that better? Yeah, thank you. I have reduced the assessment down to 4 pages. You'll be happy to hear. The strategic assessment is completed annually, interrogating crime data to identify crime and disorder trends, which are then used to set the Safer Maidstone Partnership priorities for the coming year. This draft also includes an extra appendix on the results of the community safety questions asked within the Maidstone Crime Survey 2017, which was commissioned by NBC. This year's identified 5 priorities essentially remained the same. They are, in no particular order, organised crime groups, including modern slavery, gangs and child sexual exploitation, or CSE, substance misuse, domestic abuse and mental health. No new trends or risks emerged throughout the year that weren't already covered within one of these priority areas. The Morale risk scoring matrix was again used to help determine the priorities, looking at threat, risk and harm to the public, community and organisations. They are comparable to the PCC's Safer Kent priorities and also to the police control strategy. This supported our decision to leave them essentially unchanged. There was one slight change, which was the removal of other violent crime from being alongside the domestic abuse priority. This was due to the fact that a substantial proportion, about 60%, of violent crime incidents were domestic abuse related. Any non-related serious violent crime is already dealt with robustly by the police, and a degree of cases have a crossover into other areas such as gangs, OCGs and substance misuse, and is therefore not necessarily to include as a specified priority. A full list of these subgroup actions will appear in the Community Safety Partnership 5-year rolling plan, which will be available in draft form for the SNP Away Day next week, and also the March Chi Committee, as that is a document that goes into more detail around how we've responded to the issues in the priorities. However, here's a very brief highlight of a couple of actions from each of the priorities from last year. Organised crime groups, including modern slavery. Partners and police have established a district-based forum to share information around OCGs. This has been used to target a local car wash-based OCG and disrupt criminal activity linked to it. A number of brothels have been closed down, with a significant Eastern European OCG dismantled and brought to justice. This investigation has also led to arrests in both Lithuania and Poland. Gangs and CSE. The Maidstone Gangs meeting discusses intelligence relating to local gangs and forms action plans to disrupt their behaviour, as well as lower level local gangs. A number of London street gangs are associated with the area and their drug networks, exploiting vulnerable people. A number of targeted multi-agency operations have taken place in the town, which have had a positive outcome on disrupting gang activities in the borough. Work is being done in secondary schools and also via outreach to help educate young people on the risks of becoming a gang member and also of the gang culture itself. Substance misuse, education, prevention, enforcement and treatment remain at the forefront of the SNP's response to substance misuse issues within Maidstone. Figures this year show a slight 1% drop in drug offences, a good sign up to the reducer strength scheme for off licences that are approached in the town centre, and also a slight rise in alcohol-related admissions. We continue to fund a substance misuse-related theatre project, which delivered to all Year 6 pupils on the cusp of moving up to secondary school. Also worked with the community payback team to turn an ASB hotspot in the town centre, frequented by street drinkers and known drug users, into a community garden. Domestic abuse and other violent crime. Maidstone has seen an increase of about 11% in domestic abuse crimes and serious incidents. Other violent crime rose by 43%. Maidstone has the second largest nighttime economy in the south, and stranger violence in the town centre was the lowest for some time during this festive period. Domestic violence accounts for 60% of all violent crime, and this will continue to increase as the public are reassured that they can be safeguarded if they come forward and report domestic incidents. Sexual offences, especially rape, is on the increase, but up to 75% of this is historic reporting, often by domestic abuse victims who are no longer frightened to come forward and report offences. The new vulnerability police model for investigation is providing an enhanced service to victims, and there continues to be more reporting as police and partners increase accessibility to services and safeguarding. Mental health. In Maidstone, during 2016-17, the use of Section 136, where those experiencing a mental health episode are detained under the Mental Health Act for their own or others' safety, rose by 7.5% to 72. Young adult mental health referrals was down 10%, and older adult referrals rose by 8%. The SNP had a subgroup meeting for the mental health priority, which conducted a horizon scanning exercise on the provision, trends and risk around mental health in the borough. It was noted that there were already other forums where mental health is discussed at a strategic level, such as the Mental Health Action Group and the Kent and Medway Mental Health Crisis Care Concordat. We decided to link in with those groups rather than introduce a specific subgroup for this priority, and we seek to raise profile and lower the stigma of mental health through the promotion of awareness campaigns and the inclusion of mental health considerations in organisations' operating procedures and policies such as wellbeing, etc. As I mentioned previously, there is an SNP away day on the February 20th to help set the action plans for these 5 priorities. Just moving on to the crime data itself, since April 2017, there have been changes in the recording of offences. These are now individually recorded rather than grouping them into one offence. So, for example, an affray involving 6 people used to be recorded as one offence, but it's now recorded as 6 separate ones. This can explain some of the figures in the crime data rises and will be the same force-wide. Police Statistical Process Control Charts, or SPCs, again we used this year, and on page 17 and 18 can be seen that locally victim-based crime and violence against the person has seen an increase over a 5-year period. This will be in part due to the changes in those recordings I've mentioned. Also from April, burglary has been split into residential and business community, so I won't give any true comparison on those figures until next year. Shoplifting is still decreasing and against a forced trend in Maidstone. The remaining 3 crime types, vehicle crime, criminal damage and theft, have held relatively steady over that period. The Maidstone Crime Survey of 2017 questioned over 6,000 randomly selected households. We then compared crime type figures at ward level against residents' perceived risk of being a victim of crime in the area of residential burglary and violence against the person. Interestingly, the tables show a higher fear of crime in low crime areas and vice versa. It was decided that better use of social media by partners to positively promote good news stories around convictions and further awareness raising around crime reduction could help to balance out the perceptions of crime. The overall survey showed that the majority of those that took part were not worried about someone breaking into their home or being assaulted, and the results are shown in Appendix 5 of the strategic assessment. Total recorded crime overall, as with the rest of the county and indeed the country, crime figures were up 32% for all recorded crime. Kent force-wide was 30% up, and Maidstone was ranked 6th in the county, which is a continuing position on previous years of where we sat with regards to rises in crime. Violent crime, as mentioned, saw an increase of 43%, which was lower than the division and county rises, and the 4th lowest rise out of all 13 areas in the county. Hospital admissions for assaults were up. However, we are probably the largest nighttime economy in Kent and also the largest authority by population bar Medway. Domestic abuse showed an increase, but the repeat percentage figures remained fairly unchanged. Sanctuary assessments, where we help to avoid domestic abuse victims fleeing to a refuge by adding extra security measures to their property, has seen a slight decrease. This could suggest that early interventions via the one-stop shop, for example, are reducing the amount of high-risk cases that need sanctuary support. ASB was removed as a named priority last year, as deemed as business as usual for all partners. We saw a decrease of 12%, with county decreases of 11%. Again, as a percentage decrease, we sit mid-table for the rest of the county. Substance misuse saw a 1% drop in drug offences. Force reduction was 4.8%. A 12% rise in alcohol-related hospital admissions. And also, we still saw a 15% rise in MPS, or psychoactive substance-related hospital admissions, which could be left over from having the most head shops where these products were sold in Kent before the Psychoactive Substances Act came into being in March 16. A 29% increase in drug treatment for adult drug treatment services, and a 13% increase in needle exchanges. Shows that a greater majority of those using syringe exchanges are actually accessing treatment as well, so that gap is narrowing. The National Drug Treatment Monitoring Service has shown a year-on-year reduction in the amount of children under substance misuse services, and also a 45% reduction in MPS-related problems than last year. Needle fines within the borough as well have also shown a general downward trend. Integrated offender management and reducing reoffending. There's been a 17% decrease over 3 years in first-time entrants into the youth justice system, which helps with reducing the stigmatism of young person with a criminal record, and also reduce, hopefully, future prolific offenders. The integrated offender management cohort expanded from just vehicle crime and burglary offences to those looking more at threat, risk and harm, so their cohort has increased. Maidstone has the most successful IOM programme in the force, reducing burglary and prosecution of those offenders who do offend. Of those community cohort for the IOM, they also saw an 88% reduction in reoffending. Mental health, the use of Section 136, as I said, has risen the last year, which is 38% rise over the past 3 years. Young adult referrals were down 10%, older adult referrals rose by 8%. This could suggest early intervention for young people, reducing the young adult referrals, and also an increase in age or substance misuse-related mental health issues in older adults. Finally, unlawful encampments. We saw 12 unlawful encampments on council-owned land in the past 12 months, and we're also notified of 3 others on private lands. A revised protocol is being signed off by the new financial year, looking at a wider range of enforcement possibilities. We also gained a positive reputation in the county for swiftly dealing with unlawful encampments, and I think that helped overall reduce the amount of numbers of unlawful encampments that we got, but as I say, time will tell. Thank you very much. Welcome any questions.
Thank you, Nick. Questions, members? Councillor Gooch first. Okay. Councillor Gooch, would you like to come forward first, please?
Thank you very much, Chairman, and I very much hope that my questions don't encroach on what the committee wishes to ask. So I apologise in advance for hopefully not duplicating what you want to do, but I'm sure that won't stop you. This was a bit of death by data, wasn't it? I have to say, I looked at these figures, and actually I appreciate that the way that they were put together, and I was going to say thank you very much for the information, because I appreciate that there has been all sorts of changes. It's been very difficult to compare one year with another year, and then we've got to try and make sense of it. So my first question, if I may, Chairman, is how do you think this awkwardness with the data affects the way that you handle the priorities, because I'm assuming that your priorities change and adapt to whatever the data says. So sure, that it must impact on your work.
Yeah, good evening, Mr. Chairman. Evening, councillors. It's an interesting question. The police have moved to judging everything by threat, risk and harm. So that's where our priorities will be. And looking at the most vulnerable in our communities and those crimes which are the most serious and carry the most consequence. It can't be taken lightly that the police have seen a cut across Kent in the last 5 years, every year. That we've seen that, down 1,000 officers since 5 years ago, nearly 1,500 staff reduced as well. So, although we get data and we look at it, we look at what the threat, risk and harm is within that data. So, therefore, when we say we're looking at the priorities of domestic violence, it's how serious is that? What levels it sits at? If it's high risk, we're obviously going to invest in that to more of a degree. Also, identifying it is the first thing, which is why it's gone up, because people are coming forward. So I think data is just the key, because I could, like anybody could probably talk statistics in my favour or not in my favour. Anybody could. I'm brutally honest. Crime is going up. We'll look at those areas that carry risk, which will be around children, it'll be around vulnerable adults, it'll be around vulnerable people, it'll be around your serious crime. Burglary will always be a priority to me. All the time in Maidstone, that's a crime that has serious consequences. I'm talking about housebreaking, because they've merged those statistics where you look at if someone's shed is broken into in their garden, that is now burglary residential. It didn't used to be. We'd break that down into another category. And you could say it's still an invasion of privacy, and but if someone goes into your home, we take that really seriously, and we always will, certainly in Maidstone and within Kent Police. So in answer to your question, I think you need to look at, what are the threats that really affect, the people we all serve, and that's what we'll target. And if we're failing to do that, then that's what we need to prioritise.
Helpful.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the only other thing to add to that is the morale scoring tool, which Mr. Athbone has referenced. The morale scoring tool is management of risk in law enforcement. The reason why we introduced using that toolkit last year was the changes in data don't really allow us to measure that threat, risk and harm very well. Things like child exploitation, for example, where there are low numbers of recorded offences, but the impacts and threats for young people for those types of offences is very high. The morale scoring tool allows us to use the data that we have, use the analysis of risk in order to help identify those priorities above and beyond just looking at volume of crime.
May I just ask a couple more? How will you promote, I do support what you're saying about promoting good news stories, because it's the issue, isn't it, between perception and reality. I think that's always been the way, no matter what the statistics tell us. But how are you going to promote those good news stories? I ask because my hair stood on end a bit when you mentioned social media. I'm one of the people, I don't do social media, and I know certain ladies in my patch, and no doubt elsewhere in Maidstone, don't use social media. They want reassurance. And so how are you going to communicate that?
Yeah, if I can answer that one, please, Chairman. It's, from a policing point of view, it's about everything. When it comes to media, it's about using everything that's there. We've got a really good sort of communication department, a media department. Yes, social media is becoming more and more important, maybe not to us, and I agree with you, I don't really use social media, but to some people within our society, some people within our communities, social media is the way they communicate, and we've got to recognise that. you are right, and one of the things that we were talking around was around how do we get those good news messages out. And I was talking earlier, sometimes the issue we have from a policing point of view is it doesn't sell, people aren't that as interested, but every single day we have a media officer who sits within my department, and we are constantly in contact with the local resource, the local papers, the local media, pushing out the good news, the arrests, the people that we are arresting for burglaries, the drug dealers that are being brought to justice, etc. Every day, that is being put out there. We just got to put it out in as many different formats as we possibly can, and social media will form a big part of that nowadays, unfortunately for some of us. But if you talk to my children, they don't watch the 9 o'clock news. They don't watch them, even if it's at 9 o'clock nowadays. But they don't watch the news on TV. They get everything from Snapchat, Facebook, whatever else it is that the kids use these days. But
thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the data sets that we used for the strategic assessment was the information we gleaned from our resident survey. That provides us with a very rich data set that we haven't really finished going through. One of the things obviously that does tell us is demographics for some of the areas where the concerns have been raised, this disparity between fear of crime and actual crime rate. That data will mean that we will be able to start working around targeted messages for certain groups of people. Young people, obviously very tech-savvy, like websites, like social media, but that doesn't tick the boxes for everybody. So we are working with our comms team to go through some of that data, working with the police, coming up with some joint messages and then identifying the best way of getting those messages out.
Thank you, that's very useful to know, and I'm glad you referred to our local Maidstone survey, because I noticed that on page 46, it seems to me, I don't think I've misread it, that the somewhat worried quartile, or part of the pie, seems to be greater around how worried are you about being the victim of fraud or identity theft. It's a bit odd. And I certainly know, I can only speak from my own constituents, I'm afraid, but I'm sure it's quite common across Maidstone Borough. It's the elderly and the vulnerable people who are subject to fraud, whether it's somebody taking their identity or a phone call from somebody saying they're a bank or a car, which you know about. But what I would like to have from you is clarity. People associate fraud with police. They think, oh, something's happened, I've got to ring the police. But that's not actually the case. Could you please clarify for me what we should do as councillors when we know that somebody has suffered from a fraud problem? Do I not ring 101? What do I do, and what happens, and what guarantees can you give me that that will be followed up by another area such as Action Fraud, over whom we have no control or advice or influence? Thank you.
Turn it off again. Is that better? The advice would be, yes, do contact the police. Go through the IMU, our Information Management Unit, so through 101, and they will do the referral to Action Fraud if it's needed. Action Fraud, just to clarify for people who don't know, Action Fraud don't actually investigate any fraud. They kind of collect the data. What they will do is they'll collect it, assess it, look at whether they've got any patterns or whether it's linked to anything else. They will then put together an investigation pack almost, and they will then send it out to the relevant area. The majority of the items that Action Fraud deal with, because the frauds are multinational and go across different sort of areas, will end up going to the City of London Police, who sort of will head the sort of fraud sort of teams, but a lot of it does come back out to local areas. Now, what we've done within Kent Police, we've got a dedicated team now, fraud team, that will deal with all those, so they'll start picking up those patterns within Kent locally. And again, where we've changed under New Horizon, where we're looking at vulnerability now, one of the big key messages is around how do we get that message to those vulnerable people within our communities to stop them being victims in the first place. You know, when somebody phones them up and says that they're from a bank, what to do and what not to do, and there's a lot of work going on to try and get those messages out there. But again, it is a really hard message to get out to some of our very vulnerable elderly people in communities who are unfortunately very trusting of people they phone up.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that and just say that's about all of us, I think, in protecting those people. You know, that's about you, me, anybody who's got a neighbour that's elderly or knows somebody, I think. It's about listening and hearing what's going on, and then feel free to ring us on 101. And I know that's not the best and most efficient system in the world. However, when we look at, me and Mark every morning would look at every crime, if we can, that's occurred in our districts. We'd review that, and where we identify a vulnerable victim or an elderly victim, we would try and send out a PCSO to investigate and actually give some reassurance and actually personally visit that individual. And then we'd ask them to try and contact family members and build some kind of system around the individual, because we can't look after everybody all the time. So I think that's my plea. It's about the communities that we all work for, and just getting them involved, the families involved. Obviously, not everybody's got somebody they can rely on, but as a community, I think you can prevent a lot of fraud and help us out.
I'm almost glad to hear you say that, because I certainly put something about it in my newsletter, but of course I've always been saying contact the police. And my last question, it really is my last question. I'm very interested in the emphasis on prevention, and in our town centre there's an awful lot of prevention that goes on with the nighttime economy. How do you think that fits in with the work of the police, and do you think you ought to be playing a greater part in it?
I'll start that and say yes, without a shadow of a doubt. This is about resourcing priorities, unquestionably. When we go through the presentation, I'll be able to give you some more detail around the numbers of officers, etc., in each part of our business and what they're doing on a daily basis, and you'll see there is very little fat left over whatsoever. I mean, I'm extremely proud of the service. We are delivering a great deal, unquestionably. And in my time, since leaving the military, joining the police service, I've never seen officers work so hard. There's no doubt about it. I wouldn't say if they didn't, they are working flat out. So in terms of the nighttime economy, that's about when there's a priority. When we had, I think it was the band, was it Fat Boy Slim, whoever he was, Slim Boy Fat, whoever it was, on those occasions, yeah. Yeah. On those occasions when there's something going on, then the police would inevitably try and support that through us, through the special constabulary, etc. But in terms of everyday policing of the nighttime economy, every weekend, unlikely at this stage the police will be involved week in, week out, because there might be something else going on, whether it could be a football match somewhere that my resources are taken to across the county. It could be a trap and cart race that the gypsy community are having up in Swanley. But those limited resources will end up prioritising what is carrying the most significant risk. The nighttime economy will always carry risk, and we're grateful for all our partners who are involved in it. But yeah, we will. As times hopefully move on, as we'll see in the next, hopefully, 2 or 3 years, it may be we'll get much more into those parts of our business.
Yes, sorry, Fal, I was just going to come in and just sort of say that actually working with our partners in the nighttime economy, because part of my role is to work with both nighttime and daytime economy in the town centre. I'm really proud actually, because the input that we give to them and the work that they actually do, and the fact that you've got within Maidstone, I think it's the 3rd largest nighttime economy in the south east. You're nowhere near the 3rd most crime-ridden nighttime economy. We don't get, for example, we hold a nighttime economy forum. And we sat down before Christmas with all the clubs in the nighttime economy to ask them and talk to them about the issues they were having. Not one club raised an issue with the police around problems that they were having in the nighttime economy, which I think speaks volumes about how they feel that the town is run and how confident they are in what's going on out there.
So actually we are complementing the work of the police, which is good to know. Chairman, thank you very much indeed for having allowed me the time, and thank you, members, because I've pinched some of your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Cooch. I have Councillor Ring.
I'll give my apologies in a minute, Chairman, because I'm not feeling very good, and I'll also tell you that Councillor Perry isn't. He's sitting here in sheer agony. But anyway, I'd like to come in with my normal. I don't know how many more reports I'm going to see or hear. Now, we got this report and we've all read it, so we came with our questions. I've just sat down and time wasted where the officers have read it again. I get really, really worried about waiting for surveys to come through. No disrespect, but it only comes with good news. And that isn't what we're here for. Well, I'm not here for. I come here to sit on this committee because I live in a community. And there seems to be a disillusion that you can have rural, you can have the town centre, but the urban area in between sometimes misses out. Because, one, the actual people that are sometimes victims of crime wouldn't even know what the survey was to fill in or what to do with it. So we won't get a true story there. I also worry about, if this document is for public, then I would like to ask them in the next survey how many people understood it. How many people actually stood this document from all walks of life? So that would be the second thing is. The third thing is, how are we going to stick up for the people that are quiet? They're quiet because they know no different. They ring the police and then the police say a number. And I am not blaming you guys on the street, and I'll be open and honest with this. We can sit as committees, because every year the crime figures change. Why do they change? Because we now do it this way, and we never do it that way. Well, as I said tonight, gentlemen, I may be a Conservative, but I'm absolutely ashamed of how this has gone down the road. That a person cannot report a crime and only want to give out good stories. Well, it isn't so good out there. And could you kindly give me the number of actually how many street gangs are actually in Maidstone? Because last time we had all this, I got people ringing me saying we've got gangs everywhere. And I'm saying, no, I don't think we have. But again, it's been mentioned a lot tonight, gangs and all this sort of thing. So can someone tell me, is there any gangs, just so I can let my residents know? Thank you.
Who's going to answer?
I'm going to answer that, Mr. Chairman, if that's okay. Mark might contribute in a minute. Gangs, big priority. The reason being it's about preventing them getting established within the Maidstone district or any district of Kent. That number will fluctuate, because they come out of London and try and set up, that's what they call a county line, tries to set up in Maidstone or any other district and then begin its drug dealing through oppression, picking on the vulnerable, picking on users and setting up a cocoon, a nest to deal drugs from. They call it a county line. The county lines in Maidstone has reached a peak probably 6-9 months ago at around 10 lines. Currently, 3 lines exist that we know of. We've dismantled the other lines, and we continue to dismantle them week in, week out with a team. That team used to be called Op Thor, which is a great name, the Mighty Hammer. They're now had to change to be corporate, they're called Op Raptor. That's the same team, the same individuals who are first class at doing that. So that county line gang number is 3. We keep control of it. It might go up slightly, it might come down slightly, but we are on top of that. It's a problem, but I wouldn't say it's a huge problem in Maidstone. If you went to Thanet, 20+ lines. Yeah. Local gang. I'm going to talk about the local gang. We're handing to Mark for that because he's dismantled most of that and is doing some work on it now.
Local gangs, 1. To be honest, there's one gang in Maidstone that causes us, that we would say is a gang that we need to focus on. A lot of work is being done around dismantling them and around, just lots of work around different orders and what we can do around prosecution of those, but also about protecting those vulnerable and stopping people going into that gang in the first place. One of the issues that we find, and it comes back down to what Councillor Gooch was saying around the media, is every time there's a fight between kids, it gets linked to a gang. It's not all gangs, you know. Kids fight. They have done since we were all little, and that happens. But the problem is because it's the media, it sells if they link it up into gang fight in town centre. You know, 9 times out of 10 that you read that, it's nothing to do with the gang that that exists in Maidstone. But every time there's an incident, that there are youths fighting, no matter where they are, we always look at, are these members of this gang? Is there anything we can do to prevent, to prosecute, to persecute these people, to stop them offending and causing any further problems? So yeah, from a Maidstone point of view, there's one gang in Maidstone, youth gang.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can I just add to that we are talking about prevention. This is early intervention to prevent Maidstone having a more significant problem. Some of the young people that are involved in gangs are not just involved in crime, they are themselves a victim. And quite often we overlook the fact that those vulnerable young people have been taken advantage of and coerced into becoming involved with gang activity. So this is about safeguarding of young people and prevention to stop a problem from occurring in a Thanet type situation in Maidstone.
Any other questions, members? Councillor Garton.
If I can just continue on the gang theme and bring that together with young people and young people with mental health issues. There are huge waiting times for CAMS for young people, not your problem, not the issue tonight. But obviously, those must be the most vulnerable people, and a lot of gangs or gang-related unrest, Brenchley Gardens, to mention one of the hotspots. It involves children and young people from special schools, from a special educational needs background. Now, mental health has been highlighted as your priority. Could you give us a bit more insight, mental health versus gangs?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's important to say that with the early help team, there is a lot of work looking at young persons' vulnerabilities, mental health being one of those. And there is a project at the moment where there is a CAMS worker embedded within the early help team, so that the access to the service is hopefully going to be improved from that. There's also a rollout of a programme called Head Start, which is actually based in the schools, and that's around giving young people the opportunity to speak to somebody in a safe environment around their mental health and their well-being. I think we're very aware through the multi-agency gangs group that we've got formed, that the schools are engaged, that we are looking at how young people can be groomed into gang activity, but that also includes things like child sexual exploitation, body image, issues with self-confidence, those sorts of things are also being highlighted. I think the crucial thing at the moment is there is a lot of multi-agency work through Switch Cafe, through Early Help, through SALUS, the Youth Intervention Service, to engage with young people, identify their needs and to get them signposted to the most appropriate service.
Just to add to that, we're also constantly reviewing what we do. And just today, actually, I was having conversations around the governance of some of the meetings that we hold, and what we've highlighted. Obviously, we hold a really proactive gangs meeting, but there's also another meeting which more links in with social services, mental health, etc., where it discusses some of the same children. We're now going to bring those two meetings together, so actually we're discussing them from a gangs point of view here, but from their social need, mental health needs, they'll also be encompassed, because as Matt's already said, we're very conscious. We don't treat all the gangs as these are all offenders, because some of them we will persecute and we will prosecute and we will do what we need to do through the courts because there's no other choice for us. But a lot of these kids are in this gang because they've got some need to want to be part of something, and we've got to identify what that is, why they've gone into the gang, and to prevent other kids going into it, but actually to assist them and through mental health, through whatever they need, education, to stop it getting bigger.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I'm very pleased to hear your answers, and cooperation between different agencies is always, I think, the step forward, as is communication. Now, Councillor Gooch used the phrase death by data, and that is my next question, also again relating to the cooperation between agencies and making this overstretched one-on-one service even less user-friendly. If a report which a year ago only used to be one crime number, one issue could be tacked onto that, now a boy gets jumped on by whatever, another group of boys, some social media evidence, happens to be released a few days later. The boy receives more threats at a later point. He has possibly contacts through his early help worker or another PCSO as a result of it. We are talking now 6 reports being required to 101, where in earlier days we had 1 reference number and the officers could just tag their reports to that. As useful as what statistics are we not going down the slippery slope of making the system totally user-unfriendly?
Yeah, unfortunately for us, we're governed by the HMIC. The HMIC, for those who are aware, Her Majesty's Inspectorate, Inspector Consari came and looked at Kent Police, as they have done with a number of other forces, and have basically changed the sort of rules on how we record things. And unfortunately, we have to be guided by them, by what they say. You know, it's not always what I think we would have done. You know, I think Nick gave the example of the affray that was recorded. It would have been recorded as one incident, and now, because of 6 individuals, will be recorded as 6 separate incidents. That's the rules. That's the rules the HMIC have laid down for us. And unfortunately, until that changes, we have to play by those rules. But it means we have to change our processes and how we do things and look at what we're doing. And I know the PCC is looking at some of the money that he's looking from the preset. He's looking at the 101 system to look at how we can bolster that, so that does, people do get a better service from that, because that is our first point of contact with Kent Police, and that's got to be good. That's we don't want to. He doesn't want to keep going to meetings. We don't want to keep going to meetings. When we keep hearing from people, we can't get through on 101.
So, Mr. Chairman, to that, I think it's a very good question. I think how we combat it is what I'm looking at in the future, because it's getting very difficult to get to the bottom of all these crimes and who owns them, etc. They're bringing in a system which I don't know if you heard, called EBIT. It's across in other counties now, which is basically a logarithm. Some Cambridge graduates have set up this system whereby, as crimes are reported, if there's nothing can be detected from it, there's no lines of inquiry, there's nothing, it will be filed at source. And I'm talking about low-level crimes. That removes a volume of work then from the officers that they're not looking at and being deluded by the number of crime reports. So that's one system that's coming in. I think the other thing to add is about legitimacy. Kent Police are very good at recording crime, and that's a good thing, because whatever it is that gets reported to us, however minor, we will record it. What action we take is dependent on that type of crime, but historically, a lot of crime was missed, and that could be by the vulnerable, could be by anybody, where something has been discovered, something's been spoken about, and it hasn't been crimed, or an incident's been attended, and for some reason it hasn't been crimed, whereas now it's almost a guarantee that we will crime it, and I think that's right. That we'll get a crime. So for me, it pushes crime figures up. But I'm not worried by that. It's the truth, isn't it? It's what people are worried about. It's what's been reported. So it's a double-edged sword. It's a difficult question to answer, but the rights and wrongs of it. We need to record all crime, how we link it, and how many reports we have. I think is something that can be looked at. I haven't got the answer.
Okay.
Well, you say some crimes were missed in the past. I think with this rather complicated system now, it also has the risk of crimes being lost, because a family has a contact in the police or an officer visited before, so we send extra information by email to the officer, another threat or something coming through social media. If the report back is, well, can you please call 101 and get a crime reference number, I wonder how many people will actually do that. But, I mean, these are practical questions where you are the professional, and I leave that to you. But you say it's a national problem being dictated from top, from higher up. If you, and I hope I speak for everybody in this room, if you'd like to take our concerns further up, once you talk to on a national level to your colleagues, that would be very much appreciated. And I will also have a meeting next month planned with Matthew Scott, and I will raise that with him then as well.
Yeah, thank you. We will come up. We'll make a note of that, and we'll carry that forward. It's a good point.
Sorry, Councillor Joy, you should have been before.
Getting forgotten. Thank you. Just going on from Councillor Ring and the comments she made. I don't fully agree with what she said, but when Mr Rathbone spoke, I did start to jot down things, so he wasn't reading completely from there, and I've scribbled so much down now that I can't even begin to find some of the things that my ears pricked up as you were talking. Maybe, as a way forward so that doesn't happen, could we maybe have a copy of what you've written prior to, so that we can then, you know, if you just do a quick prese of it, but we've then got that to ask you questions, because I know not everybody likes to sit and listen, but I did, to be honest, but I've messed up with all my writing. Secondly, it was difficult to compare. I've been on Communities now again for a couple of years because I had a break, and you sort of think, you just get into the thread of what's going on and it changes. And I was sitting this afternoon with my iPad on, with the strategic assessment for 17-18, with my papers going through so that I could come tonight and say, really happy about that, but it didn't work. As much as I tried, it didn't work. A couple of things that I have scribbled down separately was cooperation with partners and communication. And I do understand that you are governed by, I can't remember what the words were you used, but same in church, and you've got the diocese and you do what they say sometimes because you can adapt things, which is fine. So I think the word I'm going to use is communication. And we're very privileged as councillors because we have these papers, and at the end of it, you know, we might not understand it all, but we have some. But Joe Public out there, I feel, are not privileged, because although these papers are available, they don't look at them, read about them or anything. So I think that it's missed. We keep talking about vulnerable old people, but they're not all old. And if they are old, it doesn't mean to say that they're not good with their iPads or computers. I get very, not upset about it, but concerned that sometimes I go online and read your police, and there's things on there that I look at, why don't they put that on there? Why isn't that on there? Just the simple things that people can understand, because I think that would help. Just a suggestion. Secondly, I'm going to say what I keep saying. I look through these reports and look at your lovely graphs, and they're colourful and lovely. And I'm going to say what I say all the time. Anyone living in High Street must go, oh my goodness, because they're always up there for absolutely everything. So which is really a question, where do you consult in High Street Ward to get the worried, not so worried? And are we talking about the town centre, or are we talking about the residential areas outside of the town, which is one of the biggest areas? Thank you.
So I think with the residential survey, when it was completed, people just essentially put down which ward they lived in when they responded to the questions. With regards to the wider crime data, as mentioned in this assessment and previous ones, unfortunately, the way that police record locations of their incidents, and depending on what they are, they can't differentiate between whether it is a nighttime economy venue within the High Street ward or a residential property. And unfortunately, I don't know if that's going to be changing anytime soon. However, therefore, we have to keep leaving a caveat within the assessment that does state that, so that residents of the High Street ward aren't unnecessarily concerned with regards to crime data in their area. Also take on the fact that the very much smaller report, which I read out this evening, could be released alongside the larger report and the papers next time round, and certainly maybe look at it for the CSP plan for next month.
I have Councillor Robertson.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Referring to the minutes of the meeting last year, we did say that there was still a lack of clarity around how the police would provide a place of safety when they use their powers under Section 136 of the Mental Health Act. Now, I can't see anything in this year's report referring to that, so perhaps you could give me some information, please.
Yeah, I can update you there. The actual whole use of Section 136 has changed. The police station basically won't be used anymore as a place of safety. So anybody that's detained under 136, there are some extreme circumstances that they can be, if they're going to be very much a danger to themselves or others. But other than that, they will always be taken to a medical place of safety, and that will be either to Priority House or to somewhere like that, or to A&E. Now that is where they'll be taken now as a place of safety. Anyone?
Pleased to hear that. Okay.
She's pleased to hear that.
Yeah.
Councillor Joy again, then. Yeah.
It's not like you. Wow. Okay, going back to the nighttime economy, and you touched on that, and you talked about working closely with partners, and I'm going to bring in street pastors, which I know you fully support, and I'm on the management committee for that, which is brilliant that you send those messages quite often. But it is quite worrying that volunteers are going out into Maidstone. We're less policed than we were, and sometimes I know that when officers are called in, they don't actually know them, or it seems, I can't say they don't know, because it depends who's brought in, but they're not always the ones that know Maidstone, know the setup, and know what's going on. So that does concern me. So is there anything else that's changing to sort of help that partnership working in any way?
Yeah, the honest answer is that we've got what we've got in resources-wise, and it is around, as we keep saying, it's around managing the vulnerability and managing what we've got to do. And as I was speaking to some people earlier, the bottom line is that the calls have to be answered. You know, and the calls to assistance, calls to help have to be answered. And, you know, we saw last summer unprecedented demand on the Kent Police when officers that have basically been working up at headquarters and haven't answered a call in many years, but suddenly being told, put your uniform on, you're answering calls because the call demand is that great. I think both myself and Mr Gardner would love to be able to sit here and say to you, we are going to put 5 officers in the town centre every Friday, Saturday night, because we could do that, and it'd be brilliant. It'd be back to the old days when you had a town centre team that focused on the town centre. But at the moment, we've got to look at the vulnerability where the threat and risk is. And although I do accept there is always going to be threat and risk in the town centre, you have to weigh that up against, well, if we're putting those 5 officers in there, then people who are suffering from domestic abuse now, who are calling for our assistance, won't be getting a call, won't be getting the officers going to those immediate calls. And that's, you know, because the Friday, Saturday nights is also busy everywhere else. It's not just the town centre, it's busy across the districts. And, you know, we are looking, there is some extra officers coming, and we are looking for where we can utilise them going forward. And that is something we're constantly reviewing, isn't it, sir? We're constantly reviewing and looking at how we can you know, better police it.
Good. Can I come back? It just concerns me, at this moment, our nighttime economy has diminished in the fact that we don't have the nightclubs opening that we did have. But if they were to suddenly start up again, it's still reassuring, I hope, to think that because that was happening and there was hundreds more people in Maidstone, that we would be seen then to need more. Yeah?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. In that case, Kent Police as a whole would respond to that threat, and I'm always bidding for extra resources. So we have events on. So that's probably where you may get officers, because we've got lots of young in-service officers, loads of people joining, and they're all, most of them pretty good. But they don't necessarily might not have been to Maidstone. If they're coming in from Medway or Dartford or Dover, they could form parts of teams that could come to us, and I'm always bidding for those. So I'll take away in action, or Mark will. No, I will. We will to brief all the other districts on those, because generally the same people that come and support us, and make sure they're all briefed, the tactical teams and the proactive officers who will be sent to me, because some of them will have never been to Maidstone and won't understand all the different elements we've got of partnership work. So we'll get a briefing out to all those.
Councillor Burton.
I will come in now, because actually that's set me up lovely for what I was going to ask. Yeah. Councillor Joy's already kind of touched on it, but one of the things that always strikes me when we get this update, very much appreciated, and is usually full of bits of good news that we can all say, yeah, okay, it's nice to see that going forward, brilliant. One of the things that always really strikes me, and it's not just with this bit of partnership working, but also when we as a council do bits of partnership working in healthcare, is we get another long list of groups with an acronym at the front of them that where there's a bit more partner working going on here in the background and there's a bit more but it always strikes me that there must be a lot of overlapping conversations going on in the background between those partner groups, and I can understand how it starts like that because you have it, you know, something starts as a community group and identifies a few people who are vulnerable and they get brought into such and such a group. Would it not make the division of resources that you have to deal with, both in the background, in the strategy, in the development process of what you take forward actively on the street, so to speak, and in terms of those community groups that support the police in what they do, like the street pastors, urban blue bus, etc. Would it not be more helpful if there were fewer of those groups and they were larger and there was more of that collective working? Would that not be a way?
Yeah, I don't disagree. I mean, the issue, as I said earlier, we're constantly looking at the governance of meetings and looking where the overlap is and where we can amalgamate two meetings into one. And we're trying as a partnership to look at what meetings we actually have, who we need at those meetings, and to pull all the partners into those. So if you have got different groups, like our nighttime economy meeting, we'll try and get all those groups to that one big meeting so they all have a say in that. The issue sometimes you get with different groups is that their funding comes from so many different streams now, and you know sometimes it's down to, yes, you could have one big group, but then they won't be able to get funding because they do this or someone does that, and you find a lot of times it is down to you're quite restricted on your group is responsible for this little bit of the pie because it can get funding from here, but if it does this it won't get that funding, so someone else does that because they get funding from over here, and it's about pulling that together. I think there's a place for all the different groups doing all the brilliant work they do, but it's about us working together to make sure we pull all those groups together to say, well, you're doing that, so brilliant, well, what can you do? And then making sure we're not overlapping with all doing the same thing and no one's doing this over here.
Yeah, I think it's just such a shame it's here, such a hideously overcomplicated picture. It's a real shame to hear that comes from an issue of funding originally as well, and conflicting funding. And that's not to knock any of the work that any of those individual groups do, because I'm sure they're all individually fantastic. But I also think, perhaps most importantly, it would make much more sense to the person out there, the resident of Maidstone, if they had single points of focus to be able to report, contact. You know, they knew that if there was a problem with a gang, they weren't going to be presented with a list of possible places to go and take that. So, yeah, okay, more a comment than a question, really, but...
Okay. So to add to that, I mean, one of the things we've just been done recently with the gangs meeting is around youth provision. But the question we asked to begin with was, what is there? Where is there youth provision? What is there? And there's lots of different, some voluntary, some not voluntary, provisions that are out there. And we, one of the things we've asked them to do is to map where is our provision, where are the gaps, where do we need to focus, and where do we need some of the voluntary section to maybe look at going, because we're not, other people aren't providing it. So yeah, it does happen, but it is about us as partners bringing that together and pulling it together and having that cohesion.
Alison?
Bearing in mind that we're presenting this evening a strategic assessment, perhaps a couple of things to add to what my colleagues have already said. So the way we take an overview on that and have a range of different partners looking at what the data is telling us and coming to a conclusion about what to recommend in terms of priorities is through the Safer Maidstone Partnership. I chair that jointly with the Chief Inspector, and we make sure that we have the key agencies around the table, including the statutory ones, and that does include Health and the Probation Service and ourselves. What we bring together in the subgroups, and there is, I think you've probably gathered from what we said earlier, subgroups associated with all of these things apart from mental health. And that landscape does change because groups come and go, voluntary groups come and go, funding landscapes change. I think part of our role is to have a grip on those things and to both influence and be aware of the change that happens so that we lever as much resource to tackle the issues that we have clearly identified in the strategic assessment. I have to say I do take issue with some of what Councillor Ring said before she left. I don't have the perception that all we've talked about here is good news. I think we've been transparent about the volume, however it is measured, of crime and disorder that occurs within our borough. What we've attempted to do is to provide reassurance that we understand that and therefore prioritising and focusing on the things that are the most important because of the scale of risk to the community here. And maybe if I could just add a couple of things in terms of communication. At the Safer Maidstone Partnership meetings, we do identify the things that could provide that reassurance or the evidence that there is good impact from the actions that we're taking, and then promote that through the various communication channels of all the partners, so ourselves through our communications team, police the same, but also fire and rescue, for example, or the organisations that provide support for people who've been a victim of domestic abuse. So I wouldn't like you to think that those things aren't thoughtfully addressed, and we make use of every bit of resource that we possibly can. I was slightly intrigued by your reference to the public having a plethora of places where they feel that they may be required to report things. I'd just like it if you could clarify that.
Not necessarily in terms of reporting, because I think most people know that they report to the police, but if you're talking about organisations that might be able to provide advice, guidance, help, I think certainly as one of the individuals they come to for signposting, we do quite often get loads and loads of organisations thrown at us, and sometimes that roadmap is quite confusing, if that makes sense. So not necessarily in terms of reporting, but in terms of seeking advice and support.
Any other questions, members?
Would like clarification, because it was two things said. My understanding of education through schools, you know, you do the leave. You mentioned year 6. To me, year 6 is the last year at primary school. And then you mentioned somebody mentioned secondary schools. Are we doing both, or so? I'd like just a bit of clarification with that, please. Thank you.
Yeah, we are. There is both. There's education. You know, we've done a lot of work around the gangs, around safety and stuff in the education with secondary schools. But we've also highlighted that year 6 transition year is a real key year. It's when a lot of children feel really vulnerable, so there's a lot of work goes into that transition. Primary school, you're very much looked after. Suddenly you find yourself in secondary school, and that's when a lot of these kids get groomed into the gangs. So it's about we're sending out, all the parents now get as a leaflet that goes out to all parents in that transition, basically explain to them what to look for in their children if they're being groomed into a gang, etc. It's just to give you that advice, because that is, we found that is, you know, nationally is one of the most vulnerable times for them.
I totally get that. So does that mean... Now mine's not working. Does that mean that it is given to the children at school to take home? Yeah. So where would it be available? I mean, I'm a loving grandma, and my grandson will be going into year 6 next year. I'd just be very interested to see what that was. So is it available elsewhere, or does it just go to the school?
Some of the information provided obviously goes to the parent. Sorry. Some of the information that's provided goes direct to the parents. I think a lot of behavioural issues, start before secondary school. and that earlier intervention enables that young person to receive the best support that they can. As my colleagues already said, the transition year into secondary school is quite an important step for young people in that instance. A lot of the information, certainly that we provide around grooming and gangs, is available. It's government guidance. It's on the internet. It's freely available. I mean, we can provide links to that. I'd just like to come back to Councillor Burton's point about the complicated roadmap, and just to say that actually, we are here to help navigate that roadmap. I think if there are questions or concerns about how the partnership is structured, the way we work with other organisations, the communication channels that we make use of, we're here to help provide advice and guidance on that and help navigate that roadmap. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take you up on that, actually. Perhaps we talk after the meeting and sort something out. There was one other question that I was reminded of, which was, there's an allusion in here to the perception of people in low crime areas thinking that they're more likely to be the victim of crime and people in high crime areas. And I think actually that's a presumption I think that I could have probably guessed at in some ways, that difference of opinion in different areas. My only concern about that is, from what I read in here, I don't like to think that means as a result of that, communications are going to be overwhelmingly positive to the areas with low crime now, and we're going to go around telling the areas that have already got the worst of the issue that, don't go outdoors because it's dangerous out there.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think what the data is telling us predominantly is people feel Maidstone is safe. And I think that's really the kind of message that we need to promote. There are a lot of projects where, certainly in areas that experience a number of shed breaks, the PCSO staff are able to go out and give advice on how to prevent further instances of crime. And I know that to some extent is locking the stable door after the horse has bolted, but it does prevent somebody from becoming a repeat victim if their property is deemed to be potentially vulnerable for those sorts of issues. Mark, I don't know whether you wanted to...
Yeah, it's a really important issue, this, and it is right that we've got to really keep an eye on those that fear crime when there isn't the crime that they fear. And I'll give you an example of a situation we had last year. Was I ended up going to a parish council meeting in an area because they really feared their burglaries in their area. But that's because through social media, people have been putting around that there was almost like 2 or 3 burglaries a night in a particular area. And I think sometimes just being honest and going out and actually saying, well, actually, the real crime figures are this. And that really quietened everybody down, and it really sort of calmed the situation. So I think you're right, Councillor. I don't think we should ever hide away from the truth. But what we're finding is actually the truth isn't as bad as people think. It's more that fear of the unknown and what they don't know. And, we find it's not just in high crime, low crime areas. You find the young feel less vulnerable, but they're the most likely to be affected by crime. But the elderly, clearly, because they feel more vulnerable, feel more likely they're going to be affected by crime. And it's just trying to find that balance and trying to get the right message to the right people, really.
Anything else, members? No? Okay, I'm not going to take a vote on this recommendation until after we've seen the presentation from them. So over to Mick and Mark.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for all the questions as well. Let's hopefully answer a few more of them. Just to give you the sort of flavour of where Kent Police are going, what hopefully the future looks like a little bit, and we'll keep it very brief because it's you can ask questions afterwards. But I think we're just going to cover a few bits and pieces between me and Mark around the new horizon, what Kent Police looks like, and what the future holds for us.
Thanks, sir. Thanks, Chairman. The first slide, if we just can move over, sir. This is about New Horizon. We're just talking about New Horizon, which is, I'm sure you've probably all heard of it previously. This is the new Kent Police model that came in sort of earlier or the end of last year. We just wanted to sort of go over the reasons why it's come in, because we've had some time now. We've had some time to work with it and to see how it's working, so we can just talk about some positives and somewhere we need to sort of work on. But the reason it's come in is, as my Chief Inspector sort of said, Mr. Gardner said, we really would need to focus, with the decrease in the resources we've got, is we've had to look at where we need to focus those resources most. And no surprise, it's around those most vulnerable in our communities. And the real shift has been around not just looking at offenders, but looking at our victims and looking at the vulnerability of our victims and how can we deal with those and how can we work with them. So, I mean, just very quickly, this is the review that took place was undertaken to look at how we can improve dealing with vulnerability at all those. I won't go through the big list there, but as you can say, it goes from adults at risk, CSE, child sexual exploitation, domestic abuse, right down to sort of your missing people, honour-based violence, serious sexual assault, stalking and harassment. So it's those people within our communities that are the most vulnerable. So the New Horizon looks at how do we deal with those and how do we give those the service that they deserve from us, and make sure that they're protected. So that sort of came out of a county response, and it came out of a couple of new teams have been formed out of New Horizon. Just to go into some of these, we've got a Wanted Person Bureau. They now they look at all our wanted people who are wanted on warrants. These people could be wanted for quite serious offences, but are wanted within our communities, living within our communities. And obviously, the quicker we can get them arrested and put back before justice and put sometimes back behind bars, sometimes deported out of the country if that's the most suitable, the quicker we can do it. So we've got a team that literally that's all they do now is they look at those that are most wanted and the most potentially going to cause us the most threat and risk. We have a central referral unit which now refers all of our sort of offences of a sort of sexual, domestic nature, all go through one unit, which is a hub where you have social services and multi-agency point of access around vulnerability. So you have all these agencies at the point of access, that initial point of the call, working together for what is the best way forward with this. So when you're dealing with child, issues of child neglect, child abuse, they're there, the experts are there from social services, immediately have a strategy meeting, and immediately have a discussion for jointly how do we take this forward. And one of the really big benefits to us locally has been the mental health team. As the PCC says, quite often, mental health has a massive drain on us. Every single day you've got 2 or 3 of our officers who are dealing with a mental health issue pretty much for their entire shift. Big drain on resources, big drain on our ability to answer some of the other calls. What we've got now is we've got officers who are embedded within the mental health teams. We've got officers that actually work from and work with the mental health teams at Priority House, providing a really positive service, dealing with those patients that have been taken up there, to looking at their long-term care. So when they go back in the community, we've got plans in place for our response to them, so better cohesion between those agencies.
You're breaking me. Yeah. We did it, obviously, for these cases. I won't go through the cases. You're probably all aware of them, where vulnerable children, vulnerable adults and people in domestics ended up with serious crimes committed against them. What we've done is at Maidstone now, units exist and specialists exist based at Maidstone. So they're delivering this service for the people of Maidstone. It's something I feel quite passionate about, that we brought it back into Maidstone as a whole, with our own teams, their own officers who are accountable to me and the DCI, rather than having them at centrally based headquarters where they can get lost in the ether sometimes, and their priorities will be slightly different. So they're now working out of Maidstone, all those teams, which is a good thing. And it's the same with these teams as well. The offender management has always been there. That's fantastic, under Rob Cox. That's branched into looking after people who are now offenders of serious domestic violence. So we'll manage them under the programme as well, because we can get a grip of them and deal with them for that. And if necessary, we'll put them back in prison, or we'll try and rehabilitate them. But the answer is we have control, which puts safeguards the victim. R&D, that's our intel unit, that's always been there and will still exist in terms of intelligence that we get in developing that. Our own gangs unit is growing as we respond to that threat. The team that exists, the Raptor team, very proactive. Sitting behind them now are 4 detectives that we've recruited into that team. And they'll also look at then and tie into the CSE side of things and look after that exploitation that goes on around young people. And indeed, sexual offences that get committed against young people by gang members, etc. It's a growing issue across the county, and what I've done is get a grip of it early, so that team is now established. And that ties in with the missing child exploitation team again. This all sat before headquarters. Now we own our own team, so it's local. So again, it's local officers, local PCSOs, local partners who are delivering that service to the families of those children and those children on a daily basis. And we've actually reduced, we don't believe it, but it's incredible amount of reduction in the amount of time these children are missing. It's less than half the time now that they're missing for before we find them. And that's got to be a good thing, because your local officers have got that rapport now with the families and the individuals. And some of the girls that go missing, they can ring them up and get them to come to the police station. We never had that before, because it was alienated, it was at headquarters. So that's where we are.
Next, specialist PCSO roles. I'm really passionate about these. One of the really good changes, massive changes for me that came out of New Horizon was they looked at the PCSOs, and we've got some absolutely cracking people in these roles around, in the PCSOs. They're out in your communities, and now within these specialist roles. What this New Horizons allowed us to do is to take some of those really good officers and give them a different focus, to sort of give them a bit of a lateral development role. And we've moved, there's 4 key roles that some of our officers have moved into. So you've got a vulnerable adult intervention officer, a youth engagement officer, a domestic abuse SPOP, and an MSET, which is a missing person, child sexual exploitation PCSO. I'm going to just very quickly just discuss each of those roles individually. A vulnerable adult intervention officer is a guy called Trevor. He's absolutely fantastic. He will go out and look at those vulnerable adults within our communities. It could be your hoarders, it could be people with mental health, and look at working with those others to pull those partners together. So to be that sort of conduit to pull those partners together. He sits on our CSVG, our Community Safety Vulnerability Group, and we bring all those people to the table and look at what partners can do. And he's kind of that linchpin to pull that all together to do that. You've got a youth engagement officer, Ryan. He's absolutely fantastic. It's particularly around our gang stuff and around our child sexual exploitation. He goes into schools. Now, I'm going to say he's kind of like an old schools officer, but he doesn't do your assemblies. He doesn't do that side of it. But what he does do, he engages with our youth. He knows the youth now, and he goes in, particularly those, again, that are most vulnerable within our schools. And what he does, he links in with MSET, with the other agencies, to make sure that they're protected. So he does a lot of work around the gang violence in the schools. He works a lot with the kids, and he's got such good rapport with some of the kids now that he's starting to get. Some of these kids are coming up to him and disclosing stuff that's going on that we are then referring through to some of the police teams to deal with from a criminal background. We've actually been very fortunate in Maidstone. We've got 2 DA PCSOs. It's a job share, and they're both outstanding. They really are tackling domestic abuse victims. Our DA SPOCs are not investigating crimes. They're not dealing with it from an investigative point of view. They're there to support victims, and particularly those victims who don't support police prosecution or are reluctant to report things to the police. So if you've got a victim who's reported, or we were aware of, say, 5 incidents, but they've never actually given us a statement, what our DA PCSOs do is they go in and make gain their trust, make a rapport with these people, give them the support, and then sort of through time safeguard them and give them that side of stuff. So we're safeguarding these vulnerable people. What that has led to is, some absolutely outstanding work. Victims of domestic abuse who have been through the sort of system a number of times, who are now disclosing historic abuse of rape and stuff within their relationships to our DA PCSOs. Our DA PCSOs in Maidstone are sort of county-wide being looked at as this is the way forward that we want to run our DA spots, because they are absolutely fantastic officers. And then we have our MSET PCSOs. Again, these are our missing child and child exploitation PCSOs. They work within our missing child team. And again, we have a number of children on the district who frequently go missing almost on a weekend basis. They'll go missing. What these officers do, again, it's about building that relationship, building that rapport with these officers. And we've now got MSET PCSOs working within, missing child PCSOs working within MSET, who have got plans in place and will, although the missing person won't answer the phone to officers who ring, they will answer the phone to the PCSO, and they will tell the PCSO where they are, so at least we can check they're safe, at least we can check they're not with an adult they shouldn't be with, etc. So we can manage their vulnerability from that point of view. So it's really key roles, and really is some positive work being done by those officers. Locally, what it's meant for us is we've now got a new detective superintendent, Mr. Wilson. Basically, he looks at a lot of the vulnerability strands, and again, today the conversations I'm having with him is around the governance of things and looking at meetings. Where can we restructure? What do we need to focus on? but it's a real key sort of new role, isn't it? The detective superintendent that's come in. There's an additional 100 staff embedded into local policing. That's across the county, not just at Maidstone, to just respond to vulnerable adults, children, victims of domestic abuse. Obviously, the new horizon, the shake-up allowed us to have the dedicated gangs teams for each division to tackle the harm caused within our communities. And we've managed to maintain, we're one of the few forces that's maintained the number of PCSOs that we've got. A lot of forces have reduced their PCSOs, but we've actually maintained them, and looking at we've increased in Maidstone our PCSO coverage because they're such an important part of our team.
Yeah, and finally, this is what Maidstone looks like, and I won't go into in great detail, but it's an improved position. I will be honest and say, where we've taken 100 people and put them into frontline vulnerability role, some of those will come off the front line. So they'll come off your uniform front line and go into vulnerability roles, where we're looking after the investigations around adult protection, child protection, domestic abuse, sexual offences. So there's been officers put into those roles when they talk about the 100 into the front line. That's where they've gone. You can see I'm responsible for the response teams. That's your local policing teams out on the streets, policing, responding to calls and crime. And also the CPT that Mark looks after, the community policing team, and the community support unit who work with our partners, and the PCSOs, and the special constabulary comes under me as well, and the tactical team, and actually the drugs team as well, because I kept ownership of that. So I think we've got a really good structure. That's how we're set up. That's how we fight crime on the front line, the uniform side. And then you have the vulnerability team, which is a great progress because these people are now learning their training, learning their skills. They're going to be in a better position to deal with vulnerability. Before, you have to say, if you're at the top end of vulnerability, you get a Rolls-Royce service. But if you weren't, I think the service could be a little bit more fragmented, just due to the fact that you could be dealing with headquarters, then back to us, back to headquarters. Now, that sits firmly at Maidstone. So if you're reporting a serious sexual offence, rape, it will be dealt with at Maidstone by Maidstone officers. So I think it's a much better position to be in. And personally, Mr Wilson, who is the superintendent, is a Maidstone. He lives in Maidstone. His children go to Maidstone schools. So he's got his heart and soul into Maidstone. And then the other DCI is your investigations. That's your traditional CID side. Okay, it's run by a young chap called Johnny Armory. He's one of our youngest detective chief inspectors ever, I think. Absolutely a great guy. Completely different from me. I left school at 16 and joined the army. He went off to university for about, it felt like 15 years, but I think it was 5 years. Very bright lad. He looks after your CID, your missing children's teams, your IOM program, your offender management, etc. Again, it's a really good breakdown of responsibility. It works well. All those units, we all work well together, both at the top right down to the bottom. Well, we're all the same as far as I'm concerned. There's no top or bottom. We're all providing that service to the public. So that's how we sit. Numbers-wise, it'd be quite interesting. I don't know if you could guess what I would call a patrol strength for the whole of Maidstone district, or the whole of our district. From Staplehurst to Lenham to the town centre, up to the top of Chatham, top of Bluebell Hill, where we police. You imagine what I could put out on a resource, say on a Saturday morning. Would anybody have any ideas to answer calls? No? Probably 2 sergeants and 10 officers. So that's why, looking at the future, we're going to try and increase that front-end policing with the money that comes forward, hopefully from the PCC's promises. That will hopefully go into the front end and into the CPT around the towns and the rural, etc. I think it's important to go front end, high visibility, try and prevent, detect early, and send the message to criminals that it's not a good place to come. So that's where we sit.
I just want to add just one more thing, just very quickly. We've mentioned earlier, a number of people have mentioned earlier about us making sure that we're joined up. And making sure that we don't overlap with doing things. If you look at the priorities that have been set within the SNP priorities, you look at the control strategy that's been set by the PCC, the Chief Constable, and you look at the PCC priorities, they're all the same. which means that all the same agencies are focusing on the same things around the vulnerability and making sure that we're not all competing and pulling in different directions with the same resource, which I think is really important and can't be underestimated. You know, and it is. We've got to look locally for the SNP priorities. You know, we've got to look locally for what suits Maidstone, but it is broadly in line with the Kent Control Strategy and where we need to be focusing our efforts.
Okay, I have Councillor Joy first.
Thank you. It was really interesting. Do we get a copy of that you just read? That would be great if it could be sent out. Thank you. Everything's wonderful when you look at a slide and all these lovely words you've done. So what's the timescale? Because you don't just put these people in post and then suddenly we've got this specialised person that isn't around 24/7 to do the job that's given, but I can understand they're working with other people. So I suppose my question is it new, or is it been tried somewhere else, and because it's worked, whoever up above has said this is going to work and so we should give it a go? Or is it something that everyone is suddenly just told this is how it's going to be and we all, you know, fit for all?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. The honest answer is it was new sort of the end of last year. So it started to embed, and we're embedding it. And I did ask before I came to this, I got hold of the change team, as they're called, because we've got a team of officers who are looking at what's going well, where do we need to change. And basically, on the whole, they're very pleased with how it's embedded. The issue we've got at the moment is we've still got lots of vacancies within Kent Police. So we've not seen the model run at its full capacity, but by July this year, with the recruitment drive we're going, they believe that we'll be at full capacity, so the roles will be filled. There is always going to be some teething problems. We've taken a lot of officers who are frontline officers and put them into these vulnerability roles, dealing with domestic abuse, etc. So they've had a lot of training. That's sort of gone through the process of that now. And I think we're in a lot better position. We've got some real specialist roles and specialist officers coming out. Interestingly, about whether this has been tried elsewhere or not, I genuinely think this will be the first force that's gone down this route around vulnerability and the focus on vulnerability. We're not going to be the last, because they're all coming to us now saying what you're doing in HMRC, and now looking at Kent and saying you're leading the way, how have you done, what have you done? And we're the only force that when you look at the HMRC gradings, we're getting outstandings on goods, a bit like, you know, the Ofsted reports. We're getting outstandings on goods across the board year on year at the moment. I think it's 3 years running. The only force that's ever done it 3 years running. So our chief is doing something right.
Could I just add to that? I think the approach that was taken by the change and transformation people within Kent Police, certainly in terms of my experience, both as a borough chief exec, but also through other sort of county-wide roles that I do, was very well structured. The analytical part of it was exemplary, and the engagement with partners was really good. So the opportunity for us to contribute what we thought the issues were, you know, from a community perspective as opposed simply from a policing perspective was there. And whether or not it's a model that's been tried in other places, I think I can understand why you would ask the question, but I think what was done was, you know, was a very good objectives-led, evidence-backed up approach. And the way in which it's been implemented has been very structured as well. So I'd say just from the way in which our two organisations relate to one another, sometimes when that sort of change happens, it can be very disruptive and the relationships become very fragile. That hasn't happened at all. So I think the Chief Constable and everybody who's been involved in it deserve a lot of credit for the way in which it's gone.
I appreciate you coming in, because that's really helpful for us as councillors to know that it's something you've been involved in for MBC. I suppose the only other question I've got before I let everyone else talk, I had recruitment down because obviously I've been reading about what you're doing, so now I have that understanding as to what they're going to be doing. I still have a think. No, it was good news to hear you said the Commissioner is not taking away any of your PCSOs. But I personally, as a borough councillor, still have an issue with my PCSOs, whoever they are, for High Street Ward. But I don't want to get... We can talk about that afterwards.
Sorry, I'll be completely honest and open, and I hope I always am at these meetings. PCSOs in Maidstone, partly because of New Horizon, because we've had some really good PCSOs in Maidstone who got promoted into these new roles, which was really good, and we had a couple leave to become police officers. We have had a deficit of PCSOs for quite some time, so it's meant our colleagues, the PCSOs that were left, have been covering far too many wards. The really good news is we've got new PCSOs with us. There's 5 new PCSOs with us. So your PCSO coverage, you will see increase, and you will start seeing the PCSOs more out doing the role that you're all expecting, and you used to get a few months back. You know, I would ask you just to bear with us at the minute. They're out with us, and from what I've seen from the 5 we've got, they're cracking. They're really good, but they are in that training period. So just bear with us a little bit, but they are coming. They're coming to a town near you.
Councillor Garden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll try to be quick here. Well, first of all, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I was a bit bamboozled occasionally with abbreviations like CPT, CSU, so possibly brush up on that a little bit for us lay people. But from what I can see, and you saying you're moving the frontline staff, the PCSOs, in these very valuable specialist roles, how much is the training a problem, and also PCSOs being promoted in these roles? I mean, there was this old prejudice to a certain point when PCSOs were first introduced 10 or 15, it's more than 15 years ago now, isn't it? That it was a way of policing on the cheap. Can you assure us that this is not policing on the cheap?
If you don't mind, sorry. I mean, I'll come in there if you don't mind, Chairman. It's, yeah, it's not the roles that they're in are roles that, if I'm honest, with the policing where we are now, wouldn't be performed by police officers in any case. They're additional roles. They're roles, in fact, you know, for example, the youth PCSO would have been a police officer years ago, a community, you know, a schools liaison officer, as we used to call them. Used to have 2 in Maidstone. We're not going to have schools liaison officers again. So actually, the fact we've got a PCSO doing that role is a real benefit, and it's something that actually the Chief Constable was kind of, you know, most forces, if I've got to be honest, have just removed that role because it's not a front line, it's not a necessity. That's been removed, but our chief has sort of said, actually, we still need that link with the youth, we still need that link to the vulnerable adults. I can't afford for a police officer maybe to do that, but I can afford for a PCSO to do it if we move some of the resources across to do that. So, yeah, I think it's a real positive, and I've seen nothing but positive stuff from them, to be fair.
Can I add to that, Mr. Chairman? I think the point I'd make, I don't know how much you see or have heard of it, hopefully you have heard of it, but the whole police family is growing. I mean, police cadets are a massive investment now by the police service. We've got a unit in Maidstone that I've been a couple of times to help run it, and that will continue to grow across the whole county. So looking at Maidstone, police cadets already well respected. They'll be out doing various bits and pieces in the community. They often go on to then become PCSOs or specials. Special recruitment is on the up in the county in general. Those are then rolling in to become police officers. That is definitely the case. So it's almost a pathway that has been created, so there's no stigma attached to any of it at all. I think the pressure of resource and the pressure of demand and the expectation from the public and from me on those is that everybody works together, and it is almost, it's a conveyor belt. The difficulty is keeping pace. Because the amount of recruits we need is incredible. So if anybody you're speaking to out there at all wants to become a police officer at any age, get them into something like the police cadets, the specials, PCSO, anything, because we are, you know, we need all sorts of people from the whole of the community to come and join the police because we're recruiting in vast numbers.
Any other questions, members? No? I'm sorry, Matt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Councillor Gard, just to draw your attention to page 42 of your papers, there is actually a glossary of acronyms. There are some missing from what's been included in the presentation, so we can amend that list to include those as well.
No other questions, members, then? Okay, we will go back to the agenda for a moment, where we have to have a vote on this item. And the recommendation is that the Communities, Housing and Environment Committee, acting as the Crime and Disorder Committee, recommends to Council that the priorities, as recommended in the 2018-19 strategic assessment, to be adopted by the Safer Maesteg Partnership for inclusion within the Community Safety Plan for 2018-19 be approved. All in favour? No one against? That's unanimous. Thank you. That concludes tonight's meeting. I'd like to thank Chief Inspector Mick Gardner and Inspector Mark Hedges for coming along and giving their time. Thank you very much. Meeting closed. Thank you.